Britney had never felt so uncomfortable before. Standing at the door of her mother-in-law's house with her newborn son in her arms, she saw anger and hostility frozen in her eyes. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from, and don't even try to make me feel sorry for you. You won't succeed," Priscilla Davis said through gritted teeth. Tears welled up in Britney's eyes. "But he's George's son. How can you say such things?" Unfortunately, there was no changing her mother-in-law's mind. Mrs. Davis deeply disliked her daughter-in-law, so much so that she would gladly make her disappear off the face of the earth. Her disdain was so sharp that at times it bordered on open hatred, which originated several years ago. Britney knew that expecting help from her mother-in-law in this situation was foolish and wouldn't lead to anything good. On the other hand, she felt it was worth a try, especially considering that she wasn't doing it for herself, but for little Ethan. Britney stood there for a while longer, rocking the baby in her arms, and then closed the door and went off in a hurry. Mrs. Davis approached the window and watched her daughter-in-law in a scornful look. When Britney finally disappeared around the corner, she wiped away the tears and drew the curtains. She had her own special reasons to hate her daughter-in-law. 6 months ago, her only son George died in a car accident that divided her life into before and after. Of course, Britney bore no direct responsibility for what had happened, but for a grieving mother consumed by sorrow, that didn't really matter. She disliked Britney from the moment they first met, but not a day went by without her trying to persuade her son to part ways with her. To George's credit, he had never mistreated Britney and never let his mother's words affect him in any way. They first met 3 years ago at one of the college parties, and they were inseparable ever since. George was studying computer technology and programming at the university, as he had been fascinated by everything related to that field from an early age. The determined young man became a star from the very start of his freshman year, thus earning the respect of the entire faculty. Britney, on the other hand, wasn't shooting for the stars and was studying economics, hoping to one day fulfill her dream of starting her own business. George fell in love with her at first sight. To his delight, their feelings were mutual, and thus anyone who saw the couple had no doubts that they would be getting married and very soon. Only Priscilla Davis couldn't accept the fact that her son intended to marry a young woman who grew up in an orphanage. "George, my dear, couldn't you find a more suitable girlfriend? She doesn't have a penny to her name." But her son just shook his head. He loved Britney and had no intention of trading his feelings for money or social status, especially since he saw nothing wrong with his fiancée being an orphan. Thus, despite all of her efforts, Mrs. Davis couldn't separate the two lovebirds. She had tried everything she could think of, but nothing worked. George was willing to pay for the wedding himself and didn't want any help from his mother, who despised his fiancée with all of her heart. Fortunately, the newlyweds managed on their own and didn't turn to the groom's parents for assistance. Their wedding was modest, with no fancy restaurants, limousines, or grand ceremonies. George was always very modest and down-to-earth, and unlike his mother, didn't like ostentatious luxury. He had a real talent for computer technologies and had dreamt of making a career in this field since childhood. Britney always supported her husband and believed that one day his dream would come true. "Thank you, dear. It's all thanks to you. My mother always criticized me for being fascinated with computers and couldn't see the potential behind it. But I know that computer technology is the future," George would say with passion. Time passed, and life brought its own changes to the lives of the newlyweds. When Britney learned that she was pregnant, George's joy knew no bounds. At that moment, he felt like his life couldn't get any better. According to the ultrasound, Britney was carrying a boy, which delighted George, who had always dreamed of having a son. "Can you imagine it, honey? We could go to football games together and go fishing on the weekend. What could be better?" George would say with a smile. Little did he know that in just a short while, a tragic disaster would strike his life, the reasons for which would seem incredibly absurd. Nothing boded trouble on that fateful morning. Britney was busy in the kitchen as usual, while George was getting ready for work. By that time, he had been working as an IT specialist at one of the city's major firms for 2 months. Needless to say, he showed his incredible knowledge and professional skills in the first week. People like George were rare in the country. It seemed like he knew everything about computers. If he wanted to, George could have become a skilled hacker, but that was unacceptable to him. The young man was always a law-abiding citizen and had no intention of tying his life to criminal activities. Shortly before the car accident, George had confessed to his wife that the company's management had tried to involve him in hacking a very suspicious website. "And what did you do, dear?" Britney asked. George hesitated for a moment and then quickly replied, "I did it. I hacked the website, but I definitely didn't expect to see what I found there." Britney raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What didn't you expect to see? What did you find, George?" Her husband's face darkened, as if the mention of his actions had brought back a wave of bitter regret. After pausing for a moment, George weighed all the pros and cons and then added, "There were safe deposit boxes there, dear, and codes for them, and also account information and details of financial institutions located in the Cayman Islands, you know? I saved all the data on a flash drive just in case. You never know, it might come in handy." His words caught Britney off guard. She least expected to hear that George had gotten into such an unpleasant situation. And a week after that, her husband's life was cut short by a car accident. Experts working at the scene unanimously agreed that the cause of the accident was a brake system malfunction. But Britney didn't believe it because she knew that George was always very careful with his Ford and could never allow such a thing. Moreover, George would take his car to the shop every 6 months to get a full engine and major component diagnostics, including suspension and brake systems. Unfortunately, no one took this information into account during the investigation. The late programmer's mother even accused her daughter-in-law of her son's death. And that was despite the fact that Britney was 8 months pregnant at the time. At one point, the grieving widow felt so unwell that she had to be hospitalized for monitoring. Fortunately, Britney found the strength to carry her child to term and safely deliver him. And now, having been rejected by her mother-in-law, she had nowhere to go. Britney had no money to pay rent after George's death because her mother-in-law denied her access to her husband's assets. What did I do to deserve this? Why does she blame me for my husband's death? How could I be responsible for this accident? And what does our baby have to do with it? The young mother thought, tears welling up in her eyes. Of course she knew about Priscilla Davis's nasty personality. But the fact that her mother-in-law wouldn't even let her in with her grandchild was still shocking. With nowhere else to go, Britney turned to the owner of the rental property, Rosa Douglas. Rosa was an older woman who rented out her house not for personal financial gain, but to support an orphanage where she worked as a caregiver. She used the rental income to buy toys, clothes, and some treats for the orphan children. Rosa didn't have kiddos of her own, so she treated the little orphans as if they were her own blood. Having listened to Britney's story and seeing her holding little Ethan in her arms, Rosa immediately understood the essence of the problem. After some thought, Rosa said, "You can live in my house for as long as you need, dear. I won't charge you a cent. It's a shame you didn't come to me sooner." Tears welled up in Britney's eyes. This kind and generous woman was willing to help her, while her own mother-in-law had shut the door in her face. Since then, Britney and her little son, Ethan, began living in Rosa Douglas's house for free. Not a day went by without the kind woman stopping to spend some time with the child, while the young mother went shopping for groceries or cooked dinner. Time flew by. Days, similar to one another like identical twins, replaced each other in the kaleidoscope of family chores and responsibilities. When Ethan grew a bit older, Britney enrolled him in daycare, giving her a little more free time. Over the years, Mrs. Davis never once came to see her grandson and never even found the time to call him or wish him a happy birthday. Britney understood that Mrs. Davis blamed her for George's death, and she could never convince her mother-in-law otherwise. One day, while going through her late husband George's personal belongings, Britney came across a small box containing a single item. It was a flash drive, but Britney didn't think much of it. However, when Britney inserted it into her old laptop, something incredible happened. Astonished, she stared at the monitor, unable to believe her eyes. As it turned out, the flash drive contained the very details of the bank account that George had mentioned shortly before his death. Moreover, there were codes accompanying them, allowing one to withdraw money from any account at any moment. Britney pondered, could this data be connected to George's death? Information can often be dangerous. What if my husband found something that cost him his life? After hiding the flash drive in a secure place, Britney decided to tell Rosa about it. The woman listened to her tenant's story without interruption and only broke the silence at the end, having realized that Britney was waiting for her advice. I think you should take this information to the police, dear. Let them decide what to do with it. Keeping this information could be dangerous for you. Britney looked at Mrs. Douglas with gratitude and smiled. To be honest, that was exactly what she thought she needed to do. Moreover, the safety of little Ethan always came first for her. When Britney went to the police, her statement along with the flash drive she provided caused quite a sensation. It was later revealed that the bank account details belonged to a successful businessman whose information had been stolen several years ago. Most likely, the late George Davis had been unwittingly used by criminals who wanted to exploit his phenomenal programming abilities. Unfortunately, the company where he worked turned out to have been run by scammers who hacked into websites in search of valuable information. George didn't realize that something was wrong until it was too late, but he didn't think to save the flash drive to protect himself. Unfortunately, it didn't save him from his fate. However, the young programmer still outwitted the scammers by hiding the valuable item at his home. Thanks to Britney and her late husband, the wealthy businessman regained access to his assets. As a reward for their help, Benjamin Gomez gave the young mother several millions of dollars, significantly improving her financial situation. Now, Britney was only able to repay her debt to Rosa, but also to invest money into her childhood dream of starting her own business. Priscilla Davis, of course, remained unaware of all this and continued to blame her daughter-in-law for everything. But Britney didn't care anymore. Several years passed. During that time, Ethan grew up, graduated from school, and started college. Just like his father once did, he dreamed of a career in computer technology, and Britney wholeheartedly supported him in his pursuit. One morning, rushing to his classes, Ethan saw an elderly woman outside the campus building. It was Priscilla Davis, who had come to see her grandson for the first time in several years. Since Ethan was the spitting image of his father, the woman couldn't hold back her tears. At that moment, the young man couldn't understand why the old woman was crying. But when he saw her with his mother, he realized that it was his grandmother, Priscilla. Having apologized to her daughter-in-law, Mrs. Davis said that she deeply regretted the way she acted, and thus earned respect in Britney's eyes. Britney chose not to dwell on the past and forgave her mother-in-law, who had caused her many, many troubles. Even since then, Priscilla had been visiting her grandson almost every day, silently hoping that her late son George was watching her from above and approving of her decision to make things right.